churches, so they fall in that bucket of not having to file a 990, they'll scoop up other nonprofits and then they'll convert those to churches. So then all of a sudden it loses its transparency. I mean, one of the wildest things I would say that you've seen. So for Nathan's been working on this for over a decade. I came into this to partner up with him on it, and coming in from the outside in, coming from like the capitalist type world, this concept of like having aha moments. So an aha moment for me was when a hedge fund that managed over $150 billion was registered as a church.
Whoa.
You know what we can do with 150 billion? It's a lot. And it's registered as a church. Just absolutely mind-blowing.
So are there requirements to be registered as a church? And I think where this is important is you see a lot of New Age religion kind of re-emerging or emerging, and they're kind of doing what I saw, I think when it's in the Christian category, what is it? It's called like prosperity gospel, and you see that with like the whole like abundance and the secret and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of parallels there. So what is the requirement? Can I say that I am a devout follower of the secret and pop up a church and now I don't have to report anything, or how does that work?
So I got to sit down with the former chief counsel to the IRS in Washington, D.C. on religious tax exemption. So you're talking about the head lawyer in the U.S. that understands the entire religious sector. Like, this is the smartest guy in the U.S. on this topic. And he goes, Nathan, we cannot define a church. Because of separation of church and state in the U.S., we cannot put a definition on paper. And so that's why you have the Church of Weed and the Church of the Sun, and the church. You could start a church for the Church of the Lizard Gods. Like, the IRS and the federal government cannot tell you what you can and can't worship. So this is the rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is so deep. So you're like, okay, if you can't define a church, how do you classify a religious organization? And they have something called the 14-point checklist. It's 14 items that if you just check off some of them, you are a church. And those are...
You don't have to meet all 14.
You don't have to meet all 14. Nope. And then there's something that's more recently been called, it's called the associational test, mainly because I think I know the IRS doesn't have enough staff to actually oversee all these churches. And you made a great point earlier about Christians love a good persecution story. Like, they're always feeling like they're being persecuted. And so the IRS is very gentle with that. Like, I'm very impressed with the IRS, actually, because I was raised Republican, gun-toting, like Christian, non-denominational Christian, and I was always super, the IRS is out to get everybody. But I sit with these guys and gals, and I'm like, they're actually good people for the most part, and they want to protect religious freedom in the U.S. So it was very reassuring for me to see that. But since they can't define a church, they have to rely on the associational test or the 14-point checklist. And if you look at both of them, it's basically you need to come together to worship at least once a month under a unified creed in a physical building, and there needs to be leadership at the top. If you check those 4 boxes, you're a church. So technically in this studio, this is our building, this is the 3 of us are the congregation, and then what's our creed? I want to worship Candice's podcast. So we're the Church of Candice podcast. And right now, we don't even have to ask the IRS. This is what's crazy. I can walk into a bank with these notes jotted down with my social security number and get a bank account and an EIN number for my church.
Candice just got a tax-free ride here.
There we go.
Yeah.
And now let's go to the secular nonprofit side. A secular nonprofit has to, I can't remember the file name, but they have to file a document with the IRS asking for tax exemption. They have to prove their missions. It's a very rigorous process. So for a secular nonprofit to get that tax exempt status takes upwards of 2 years. And like legal lawyers and everything drafting this, we could just start a church today called the Candice Podcast and walk into a bank and start accepting donations.
I had no idea it was that easy.
The only difference, the only downfall is you wouldn't be able to give your donors a tax write-off receipt because the IRS does not know your entity exists. So you won't get the really big ticket donors, giving you hundreds of thousands of dollars as a write-off. But if you're a good enough salesperson, if you're smooth enough, if you've got the vision, you can get a lot of smaller donors to come on board and give you a lot of money.
So is it harder to be recognized by the government as a church?
No, you literally just say Church of Candice podcast. You file your application and you're good. But yeah, whereas secular nonprofits have a rigorous uphill battle to be tax exempt, churches just automatically get it because you're a quote unquote church.
There's it's estimated there's 400,000. Is that the right number? 400,000 churches in the United States.
And they're like all different kinds of religions, or just Christian?
All different,
including temples and everything.
Yeah. So the government sees that as we call them avatars in the show, because the IRS doesn't know a lot of them exist. As you drive by the street and you see Church of Wilmington or Church of Florida or Church of Miami or Church of Chris, you're like, oh, there's a church. So you can see it. But if that person was in the IRS and they opened up their laptop, it'd just be an avatar to them because they've never seen any documentation about that church.
In total, but so many things are considered churches. So there's a pastor in North Texas. It's got the whole private jet, all that. The home he lives in, 18,000 square feet. It would be about $160,000 a year in taxes. It's registered in the name of the church.
As like a holding, so they're allowed to do that?
It's a housing, pastor housing.
There's no cap on that.
No cap. A lot of people will argue there is, but there's not. No, because it's basically like if I'm a big enough pastor and my CPA is a good CPA, he'd be like, oh, Nathan is basically a huge celebrity in Texas.
Got it.
So he should be able to live like Oprah Winfrey. And then the IRS goes, okay, that's standard of living. Like he's a big name. He's a celebrity. He deserves that house.
So separation of church and state, obviously very important to have, but where did the tide of money come in? Because yes, no one should be able to tell you who to worship, how to worship.
Right.
That's crucial. But it didn't mean to have a hedge fund of 150 was it billion?
150 billion, yeah.
Right, when it's what $100 million can swing a company one way or another.
Yeah.
So if you're not making that filing and saying, I saw this one church, I don't know which one it was, but they basically, in order to skip filing, what is it called? I wrote it down. It's like a 13F filing, which is if you have over $100 million, you have to disclose that because you can swing a company. So they created like 20 different shell
companies. The Church
companies.
of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Was that what it was?
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's what anyone meant when they said separation of church and state.
Correct.
Yeah.
You got to go all the way back to the founding of America, right? And what I'm going to get political here because this really grinds my gears, but you have certain people saying America's inherently a Christian nation. And sure, the founding fathers used biblical principles of equality and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that's baked into our Constitution. But they were very cognizant about not calling out a specific deity. They didn't say Christ. They said under God. They used very specific language about a God. But when you look at the early church, the early America, the denominational structures were killing each other. Quakers were getting their tongues bored out. They were being burned at the stake in early America because, quote unquote, the Protestants and Baptists in particular were like, this is our country. And so they were killing other Christians. And so America people don't realize, was about to go down a very dangerous road before it was even founded. And so a guy named Roger Williams created a plantation called Providence in Rhode Island. And Providence was a safe haven for anybody that wanted to practice their own religion. And he was very, very focused on America being a country with freedom of religion and freedom from religion, because he saw what was happening. He's like, these amazing Quakers are being burned at the stake alive because their theology is different than yours. And so America, the early founding of America is very interesting in that regard. But so you have separation of church and state. Churches were actually some of the first institutions to collect taxes, because in early America there was no tax structure or government structure. And so people trusted the church. So they're like, hey, our church can collect taxes and disperse money better than John Smith down the street, But as everybody pushed west, there was no physical church to go worship in. You carried your King James Bible in your covered wagons, and you pushed across the plains, and you'd read it, and you'd read to a group of people, and no one was collecting money. There was no overhead, so to speak. And then once America fully gets settled, institutional churches start popping up. And so really until the Civil War, no churches really asked for money. Tithing disappeared in America. Like you look through the literature and there's very few references on any Christian churches like demanding money or referencing the tithes that we talked about in the Old Testament. But then the Civil War happens, everybody's poor, and these churches are like, dude, we're out of money. Like no one's giving us anything anymore. What do we do? And so they opened up the Bible, and unfortunately they went back to the Mosaic laws, and someone was like, hey, this says to give me 10%. And so boom, after the Civil War, tithing spikes in America again, and it's never throttled off again. And so when you look at the religious organizations in the nonprofit sector, though, it wasn't until 1913 that it was actually defined. And so Congress passed income tax in 1913, and they defined the nonprofit sector. Back then, there was about 12,000 of them, and this is a big part of the show. Those 12,000 organizations were secular nonprofits and churches, and they were working in local communities, really caring for the local people. And so Congress said, man, these organizations need to be protected because they're helping the needy, the poor, everything we can't do in these small communities, they're doing. So they should not pay taxes. So it's 1913, there's 12,000 of them. It's called social capital. The churches and nonprofits are building social capital in these small communities. So, okay, flash forward 110 years or 111 years, there's now 1.8 million nonprofits, and I don't want to say very few of them, the majority of them don't focus on their local community anymore. They don't care about social capital. They're looking global.